To the untrained eye, the Eurovision Song Competition is a competition that pits singers from different countries in a live performance contest to determine who has the best song of a given year. But as any aficionados of the real world know, it's so much more. Much like sport is so much more than just moving a ball around a field. Wherever you have humans congregating in large numbers, you have all the complexity that brings. Corruption, cheating, sexual taboos, forbidden symbolism, war, drugs, ethnic nationalism, genocide. Everything you can always find with humans is often just barely behind the glitter and the winking. And whilst the competition itself explicitly demands that its entries are not political, in reality, everything is political. And so it is an impossible goal to achieve. And in the same way as I love sporting events where we all meet from different walks of life, Eurovision sits at the intersection of cultural, political, geopolitical, and just human narratives that occur at any given point in time. And if you follow the news, you may have noticed that we're sitting at a few particularly thorny junctures at the moment. And what's more, if you follow the news of the competition itself, you'll see that it's struggling and straining to adapt and to reflect all of those conflicts and their intersections and simultaneously run a humble, if extravagant, song competition. Whether you're a fan of Eurovision or whether you've never even heard of it, I hope that today's episode will offer you something compelling, because the arts are in many ways the mirrors that we use to look back at ourselves. And this is just one of many cracked mirrors at the moment that are worth looking at a little bit deeper, because there's so much to talk about. Topic was one voted for by my Patreon patrons. If you're interested in joining, there's a free tier, but if you can pay, I really appreciate it. Head on over to patreon.com/Endry to join the fun. Particular shout out to Paddy and Sean, who have upgraded to the committed tier of membership. You've been supporters for many years and I really appreciate it and appreciate you. But of course, welcome everybody to the Chris Endry podcast, where today we're going to be looking at Eurovision as a litmus test of a decaying social order. Should be a lot of fun. The Eurovision Song Contest started in 1956 as a way of uniting a post-war Europe. Tough brief, as you can see. If you are fans of history, you'll notice that the first half of the 20th century is largely defined by Europeans tearing each other to bits over every topic you can imagine. Politics, race, economics, ideology, nationalism, historical wrongs, whatever. It's been an ugly mess, and what better way to pave over those cracks and bury the hatchet than by getting together and singing some songs. I genuinely think it's a great idea for that type of thing, and I love international events for exactly this. Fast forward to today, however, and while in a lot of ways the competition has expanded with the relatively recent inclusion of countries as far away as Australia, there remain a lot of holes in the tapestry. If you're only hearing now about the competition for the first time, how it roughly runs is each nation is represented by a broadcaster. That broadcaster is responsible for running whatever process to determine which individual singer they will send each year. And that singer gets 3 minutes to sing live and convince everybody that their song is the best. There are semi-finals and then a final, at which the winner is crowned through a combination of public voting and a professional judiciary. That in itself already has controversies, but I won't go into all of that stuff, because today we're going to look at who's not there. It's been a really interesting one in recent years that tells you a lot about the values intersection that is quite clearly dividing, certainly the world, but in this instance, much of Europe. And as in so many things, because the arts tend to be full of people who are much higher in trait openness than other fields, you get an overrepresentation of people with a progressive politics appetite that forms cultures, subcultures, and in-group, out-group behavior that is certainly out of step and often alien to the mean and other communities that form up larger societies generally. With Eurovision, this is particularly striking, where there has been, in the past 10, 15 years, a kind of explosion in awareness, discourse, visibility, and celebration of people of sexuality and gender expressions that are outside the conventional expressions of boy, girl, man, woman, heterosexual, etc. And this cultural awareness is something that's, I guess to characterize it cheaply, has been to some degree in most Western countries celebrated and revered. That's not universally true, so I don't want to pretend that's the case. And kind of as you sweep from west to east in Europe and then across the Eurasian continent especially, you see a diminishing of that, where the response to that liberation and celebration has been, I suppose, a cultural clamping down, where there's a reiteration of what are declared as traditional sexualities and gender expressions. So That's something, I guess, strangely, because it's just a song competition. That's something that has been the point of contention for many countries now for withdrawing their acts. And I'm sitting in Hungary, which is famously currently led by ethnic religious conservative party Fidesz. And despite having had a long tradition of participating in Eurovision, they withdrew their participation, I think, in 2019. And while there was no public statement accompanying that, that was largely seen to be as a repudiation of that celebration of different sexual and gender identities that had found a happy home within Eurovision culture, subculture, and fandoms. And as I said, it kind of tracks west to east, where Hungary pulled out without giving its reasons. Other parts of the world were far more explicit. China, for example, no longer broadcast the competition. The Chinese channel that broadcast Eurovision was banned in 2018 for censoring LGBTQ plus content, such as rainbow flags and a performance featuring a gay love story. The EBU, the European Broadcasting Union that runs the competition, they stated that this censorship was against its values of diversity, and they immediately terminated the partnership. This is not an unusual thing for Chinese television. Homosexuality itself has been decriminalized in China, but conservative cultural attitudes still reign pretty strongly. There are government guidelines that have classified homosexuality as abnormal and, quote, unfit for Chinese television. This is just an example of where there's that cultural clash, and that there are different stories from nation to nation, but you see many nations, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe, withdrawing from the competition. So China's obviously not a participant in the competition, but Turkey, they pulled out in 2013, and whilst it's the same sort of thing, publicly they blame the voting system and the automatic qualification of the nations with large broadcasters. But cultural commentators there suggest that it's the social and political issues, including a divergence of LGBTQ values from the particularly conservative Turkish government, as being a strong factor. So the competition is already interesting because the fault lines of certain social and cultural discourses that you see across the world are sufficient to determine who is choosing to participate and not participate at all, which is interesting. And we'll get to the big one of those shortly. But another key reason that many states are not participating in recent years is the raw cost of doing it. Maybe when you look at the flag of the European Union, you think, oh, Europe is full of generally well-off countries. Even the former communist ones are doing okay now. And that's certainly true where Central European nations have caught up a lot economically in the last 30 years. Somewhere like Hungary would have been as low as 10% of the GDP of somewhere like West Germany 30, 35 years ago. But now these parts of the world are more like 70, 80%. So that gap is really closed. But despite that, there are still countries like Moldova, Ukraine, and Bosnia where the idea of spending 10,000 euros per hit of fireworks to be competitive in the realm is understandably considered to be too much. And so there are a whole bunch of absences now. Moldova didn't participate this year. Slovakia's out. North Macedonia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Bosnia all out. And even though that's not necessarily political division, it kind of is, because the structure of the competition, like, it shouldn't be the case that financial capacity is a reason to not be able to participate in a singing competition, and that it's structured in a way where the soft barrier of you must be this rich to participate is precluding voices from being heard, quite literally. I think that's a failure, particularly given the core mandate is to unite Europe. It's funny to have rich countries like Australia in there and not to have a whole bunch of Balkan countries involved because they can't afford the participation. And I think the discounting of the value of those absences is also a European cultural issue where obviously, all across the world, wherever there's money, you tend to have the loudest voices and the greatest say in what's occurring. And I think the competition would be considered to be in a crisis if Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark didn't participate, for example, in a way that I don't think is on the radar at all for those other nations for not being involved. And if you do follow the competition or the news, you'll know the major issue that I'm coming to talk about here, which is the participation of Israel. Now, the competition itself, as I said, is apolitical, at least in the content that it allows from its acts. They have in the past censored acts for putting stuff that is explicitly referring to historical events that may be contentious or that are pushing political narratives. But of course, it's an impossible task to censor things for this because different cultures consider different things to be political. I think regardless of your position on anything, you can only argue that Conchita Wurst standing on stage in drag persona, singing Rise Like a Phoenix in 2014 is political in its nature. And similarly, this year's entrance was from Georgia, where there are constant street-level protests and counter-protests, with both parties advocating different visions of freedom for that country. To have a Georgian singer singing about freedom is also inevitably a political thing. So on 25th of February 2022, the day after Russia invaded Ukraine, the EBU issued a statement saying that Russia wouldn't be able to participate in Eurovision that year. And the reason was And I'm going to read from their statement. The EBU has announced that no Russian acts will participate in this year's Eurovision Song Contest. The decision reflects concern that, in light of the unprecedented crisis in Ukraine, the inclusion of a Russian entry in this year's contest would bring the competition into disrepute. And it occurred in the context in which there was pressure from a lot of the other broadcasters. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the Netherlands, and of course Ukraine, publicly demanded that Russia be excluded, and several threatened to boycott if Russia were allowed to compete. And so a few months after this, the EBU had a meeting where they excluded multiple Russian broadcasters, which were full EBU members, which means that even if they wanted to come back, Russia can't be in the competition until one of their broadcasters is allowed back in again. This was pretty uncontroversial, at least in most of Europe at the time, because of the strong cultural repudiation of Russia that occurred following that invasion. I, not just to be an edgelord, but I never really liked this stuff. And I was pretty vocal about the Russian tennis players being banned from Wimbledon because I don't like seeing individuals, particularly artists, because I feel solidarity with them across all national lines. I don't like seeing individuals being treated as though they're their nation. I accept that that's not a position that everybody has and that it's more nuanced than that. Because, of course, it's one thing to say that culture is an isolated thing, but legitimacy and whatever else bleeds across all of this stuff. And that's fair enough. But I personally, I just like I think it's more fun to have everybody there singing songs. And I probably would even have the rules to allow political stuff just because because you get more interesting things. This is probably why I'm not in charge of anything, let alone the European Broadcasting Union. But making a strong stand on their values in this way has come back to haunt them very strongly, because in the last few years, if you follow Eurovision, you'll have noticed that following Israel's clearly egregious war on the civilian population of Gaza and the West Bank and surrounding nations, they have still been able to participate within the competition. And that has resulted in huge protests, which have filtered into the audience themselves. This year's Eurovision itself was, I would say, ruined is a bit strong, but it was certainly marred because they didn't pull audio from the crowd itself for the broadcast because there was so much booing in the preceding year. And so there's this kind of automated clapping, which kind of sucks the life out of it and robs you of the live audience interaction with the act. And if that extremely negative response from the public to Israel's participation weren't enough, they also went and won the public vote with an act that I don't think anybody fairly thought deserved it, and almost ended up taking out the whole thing, which, I think would have been great because it would have really put the hand on the hot plate in terms of what are you doing, EBU, and, you have to do something. But they didn't take any action, and in the absence of the EBU successfully taking any action against Israel, who I think it's pretty clear to cite their earlier judgment on Russia, do a lot more than running the risk of bringing the competition into disrepute, that horse has bolted. In fact, if you watched the 2024 final in Malmö in Sweden, the head of the EBU, Martin Österdahl, came up to give his, normal fluff, everybody claps hands for each other speech, and he was just booed nonstop, booed off the stage, and he didn't appear the following year, and has subsequently stepped down. So it's fair to say that they're in a crisis. If you haven't heard about that crisis yet, you're only going to begin to hear about it more and more, because for next year's Eurovision, there have emerged blocks where, in the absence of the EBU's action, national participants are taking their own action, with the relevant commissions for Iceland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Slovenia, and Spain, all stating that they will not participate if Israel competes due to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the violations of the stated EBU values. And Belgium has also kept up their sleeve that they may follow suit in this. I'll list them again: Iceland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Slovenia, and Spain. And Spain in particular is a big one there because it's a member of the Big Five, who are the nations that automatically qualify it by virtue of the size of their television audience. So they've been more or less at every Eurovision competition. So you might think, well, fair enough, they'll probably just choose not to have Israel because that's easier than having those 5 nations boycott. But if only it were so simple, because in response, Austria, Cyprus, Germany, Greece, Italy, and Switzerland have all backed Israel's inclusion by emphasizing Eurovision's apolitical nature and unity, which I will note they didn't back for the exclusion of Russia and Belarus. Belarus were also excluded, I should have mentioned that. But Germany and Italy in particular have not only backed Israel's inclusion, but they've threatened counter-boycotts if Israel were excluded. Guess what? Germany and Italy are also members of that Big Five. So it's a no-win situation where there's definitely going to be a division of some sorts. It just remains to be seen what it will be. Now, the EBU is meeting in December to make a decision. They were meant to have an earlier meeting on this, but they delayed. I guess they're obviously just frantically canvassing opinions and trying to find the correct level that they can operate by, hopefully including everybody. Because I should say their brief mandate and stated values is to include everybody. That's something that they've failed on a little too much lately. It could get a lot hairier. And I should say that I said at the top that I like following these international events because of the mirror that they hold up to how things are going. To speak a little more to the title of this episode, it is only well and good that there are rifts in these things now, because there are rifts in reality. It would be crazy if there was no social response to the reality on the ground. We have all sorts of outrageous wars and also tragically completely preventable man-made horrors that come with all of that. It would be wild to have large meetings of hundreds of millions of people and to not have that acknowledged in any way. Now, I know I said that I would just include everybody, and that's because I don't take this stuff as an endorsement of any of that. Would ideally love to see a world in which one of Israel's very many artists who are mortified by what's occurring, I'd like to see them given a platform. And to hear from them as well. And even if that's not the case, even if you don't get that, I still think that there's something interesting. And I would also, as I said, allow political things. I would love to hear people explicitly singing upon all this stuff. But again, that's just me and my personal taste. You don't need to take anything from that. And that position where I'm taking it as some sort of, on some scale, a hardcore liberal, it's also a path of least resistance for many of the other national broadcasters. So for most, they don't want to rock the boat and are happy to continue with the status quo. And they're worth naming as well. So there have been explicit statements of an intention to participate without commenting extensively on the Israel debate from Albania, Armenia, Australia, Azerbaijan, Croatia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Israel, obviously, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Moldova, Montenegro, Norway, Poland, Portugal, San Marino, Serbia, Sweden, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom. So also huge players. And, you can have a great song competition just from those, regardless of whether it's the 5 pro-Israel or 6 anti-Israel that follow through with their boycotts. Now, if you've got a sharp memory for large lists of countries, you may have clocked that there were a few there who were supportive of Israel's participation, who actually had self-excluded from the competition previously. And those 3 are Bulgaria, Moldova, and Romania, who all, in the space of 2 weeks earlier this month, announced that they will again be participating in the competition, having renewed funding for their entries. But also there's word that Canada's expressed interest in participating as a non-European guest. It would be their debut. But that remains unconfirmed. The final participant list will be determined in December. It seems very much to me that Bulgaria, Moldova, and Romania, who are all neighbours, by the way, a little stretch, are re-participating as an explicit endorsement of Israel's involvement so that it doesn't look like the competition is totally empty should Israel participate. And I don't know if they've been given the nudge by the European Broadcasting Union, or if they've been given support by Israel to participate, or if it's just a political thing where the local leadership of those nations have seen fit to re-enter it in solidarity. But it is an astonishing coincidence, especially given all of their announcements came in November, in that extra period that the EBU had given itself to delay announcing who would be participating next year. So, of course, simultaneous to the rift that's occurred mostly between people in their own governments in response to what's happening in Israel, but of course between governments themselves, the exclusion of Russia, who are obviously a very big country and had been a very enthusiastic participant in the Eurovision Song Competition, has seen them revive their own competition called Intervision. And where Eurovision's motto is United View Music, Intervision's motto is harmony in diversity. Basically, it's a grab bag of countries that are very friendly with Russia. But I think it's interesting. There's also some overlap between Eurovision participants, which is awesome. And if you're aliens looking at the world, surely you think, what are you idiots doing? Why don't you just have a song competition that everybody can be in? And I suppose, technically that's Intervision, but obviously they're running it knowing full well that they're trying to rival Eurovision. So I hope you're ready for another list of countries. I'll give you how they went from last to first. Russia, they weren't ranked. Very gracious hosts. Brazil, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, Saudi Arabia, who are hosting next year. UAE, South Africa, Serbia, who participate in Eurovision. Venezuela, India, Cuba, Uzbekistan, China, Madagascar, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Tajikistan, Colombia, Qatar, Kyrgyzstan, and Vietnam, who were the winners. They won with a folk tale done in a pop style. Great stuff. Interestingly, the USA almost had an entrant, Vassie, who's an Australian-American from the Northern Territory, and she withdrew reportedly due to political pressure. fun that this stuff exists. So fun. And I think that it is obviously another great mirror into the world at the moment, because I don't know how closely you follow geopolitical developments, but the rise of China, the decline of the US in Europe as they sort of pivot to East Asia, and obviously the pushback of Russia against the projected expansion of NATO, all this stuff, these are symptoms of a return to multipolarity in the world. We have different large players that act more as regional hegemons, whereas, and it depends who you ask, but between the Cold War and 5-10 years ago, the US were clearly a dominant global player. That's kind of changing, emergence of BRICS and all these other things, and that's mapped hilariously in these song competitions as well. And if you're an alien looking at the world, or if you're me, a fan of the Olympics and other global sports things, you just want to see everybody under the one tent in the one arena. And again, I should say, even though Intervision is branded as a sort of apolitical thing, like Eurovision as well, it's also, Sergei Lavrov described it as an anti-woke thing, which is, of course, a political position to take. And so it all seems pretty stupid. But if anything's going to seem stupid in this life, it's doing competitions around singing and dancing. And I think even just having these conversations at all about who does and doesn't belong, who does and doesn't get the chance to represent their culture, who does and doesn't get a chance to sing, is indicative of shifting sands in how we view each other and emerging divisions across different lines with a greater strength to where they had been in recent decades. So that's more or less the lay of it, where you've got, to characterize it very cheaply, sexually liberal, progressive Eurovision based in the decadent West, and its nature is breeding disaffection amongst many of its members. And then as you head to the east, at Moscow, you've got another axis where you've got an avowedly anti-woke traditionalist song competition, which is striving for another ideological identification. And this is kind of the good and the bad thing about the artists, because as I mentioned, they tend to skew progressive and have an open worldview. So you do get different clusters of subcultures that are often out of step with the mainstream. You know, that offers some really great things in terms of a vanguard for certain ideas and experimentation and appetite. But also, I guess the downside is you inevitably end up with a bit more division, where the identity cultural markers of in-group and out-group are not as wide or as welcoming as they are in, say, sports. For example, and this is pre-Israel attacking the poor people of Gaza, the Sydney Festival had a real issue with boycotts because they accepted a $20,000 sponsorship from the Israeli embassy in Australia to sponsor one choreographer to do a show. There were boycotts and withdrawals and all sorts of issues. Whereas now, you know, a few years into that war, the Australian ice hockey team just played against the Israeli team, no problems, no questions. And in the same way, the Olympics somehow manages to get everybody under the same tent. They even found a way to squeeze Russia back into the fold. And notably, they have athletes representing both Israel and Palestine. Whereas in the Eurovision Song Competition next year, we won't have singers from both Israel and Ireland, which is super interesting. So yeah, fairly. I think fairly enough. That is a fault line, and then it's interesting to see the cracks within Europe. The European Union, I guess, is a cultural and values based project amongst its economic functions, and that is also something that's put to strain between East and West, obviously at the moment. And those strains are visible within the competition based on all the aforementioned countries I mentioned not participating. And all of this is to say nothing of the acts themselves, the choices that people make in how they perform and what they present. Those, I think it's safe to say that you won't see a performer like Nemo winning Intervision, and you probably wouldn't see a singer like the Vietnamese Duck Fuck winning Eurovision. But maybe I'm wrong, and maybe there's some. Gandhi's a bad example because India didn't end up united. But maybe there's some Martin Luther King figure that's going to come along for the globe, specifically for song competitions, and will end up with what I want. Maybe the Olympic Committee will take it all over, and we'll get every country doing everything, and we'll get to see the full tapestry of humanity and our beautiful, if constantly warring, ways on display. So I hope that was interesting, and I hope that gives you a new lens for enthusiastically approaching Eurovision 2026 as the songs start to come out. And there will be this meeting later in December, so keep an eye out for that. And thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week. Thanks again to the patrons for voting for this episode topic. And a reminder that if you do want to get involved, jump on over to patreon.com/Andrew. But if you don't have any coin or you want to support the show in another way, share it around, hit like, blah, blah, blah. Go back through the episodes, find one that you think will be really good for a friend and send it to them, because there's a lot of stuff there. If the generous feedback that I'm getting from so many listeners is true, then I think that there could be something valuable there for, let's say everybody on the whole planet. And if they all just join the Patreon, wow, then I could finally buy that Great Barrier Reef that I've been eyeing off. That's it from me. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.